So we got to talk about the Furness Railway engine. So a while ago, I made a tweet answering to a question of what scrap locomotive would you bring back in exchange for a new one in operation today? And I chose the Furness Railway's J1s, or Albert siblings, because I feel they had so little of their class made and so little time in operation. Today, I kind of want to elaborate a bit further from that post. Now, the Furness Railway is, while an amazing railway with some very fascinating history and lore, one of the most underrated railways in Britain, in my opinion. And I can definitely say the same thing about its engines, cause child, some of these engines didn't really thrive in railway life much, and it's kind of sad to me because some of these engines had some pretty unique designs for their bases. I also feel the Furness deserves more recognition as a historical railway in general. But before we go on further about these ill-fated locomotives, I want to recap the Furness Railway itself a little, and briefly talk about its existence for a minute. So the Furness Railway opened as a small local line in 1846, and mainly operated freight services with passenger services as a sideline. It had iron ore fields and slate quarries that would deliver iron ore and slate to the village of Barrow at Barrow Docks, where it would be shipped in other parts of the country. Over time, with several branches, the line extended from Kemforth to Whitehaven, with their best-known principle of this being the line running to Lakeside and Coniston. The Furness Railway served up to at least 100 miles of tracks and sidings with around a total of 20 signal boxes, and was well known for promoting industrial places like the steelworks, the shipyard, and smaller businesses like the corn mill. When it first opened, a young man named James Ramsden was anointed as the locomotive superintendent, and was so for about 4 years. He played a key role in the expansion of the railway to form the new town of Barrow in Furness, and eventually was promoted as managing director up until his retirement in 1895. Through 1850 to 1896, Richard Mason became the second locomotive superintendent, and after him, William Frank Pettigrew would take over. More on them later. After Sir James Ramsden's retirement, the railway was in need of increased traffic, which introduced a cross-based steamer service that would run tourist trains to Lakewood, as well as other much improved services and facilities that were distributed with natural qualities that made them stand out to the public. However, while this increase in traffic brought up their passenger revenue and gave the Furness positive reception, the dividend per annum fell back 0.5% due to a depression of iron and steel. And even with the new tourist trains and development of warships at Barrow Shipyard, the dividend remained at around 2% a year for at least 27 years of the Furness Railway's existence. Following the Railways Act of 1921, the independence of the Furness came to an end when it joined many other railway companies to merge into the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, or LMS. However, despite this, some of their ironworks and branch lines still operated for a period of time. Carnforth and North Lonsdale at Overston works both closed throughout the 1930s. Then in 1948, the LMS, including Furness, moved under British Railways through nationalization, and later on, Barrow Works would close in 1963, the Overston Lakeside branch would close in 1967 by British Rail. However, a section of it running from Lakeside to Haverthwaite would reopen as the now Lakeside and Haverthwaite Railway, and Millen Works closed in 1968. As of recently, Barrow Docks still operates building submarines for the Royal Navy, and the Furness Main Line itself, while having not much freight besides Sellafield, still runs services around the shores of the Irish Sea and Morecambe Bay, providing occasional views of the Lakes districts seen on the shore's opposite side. A lot of their lines and stations are still open, though a handful of others have closed throughout time. So now that we got the Furness Railway itself out of the way, let's talk about these engines of theirs. The strange part is, though, that there were no actual engines built at Barrow Works or any local works really, although some were built at Constitute companies of the Furness among other places, including, as you may have already guessed, Sharp Stewart and Company. Sir Ramsden, Mason, and Pettigrew were all in charge of engine designs at these numerous works and factories. During their positions as locomotive superintendents, while Sir Ramsden built the railway's first two A2040s, Mason was responsible for the buildings of locos like the E1s, A4s, K2s, B3s, D1s, J1 rebuilds, etc., while Pettigrew was responsible for the D3s, G5s, D5s, M1s, L4s, and L3s, etc. After he stepped down as superintendent in 1896, engines designed by Mason like the D1s were later rebuilt by Pettigrew to be up to date by being fitted with new things like automatic vacuum brakes and steam heating, as well as Pettigrew's custom design of larger boilers. However, Mason's E1s were redesigned into J1 tanks by Mason himself when they ran branch line services. After Pettigrew, David Rutherford was the new superintendent, but he was only in charge 5 years before the railway ceased to exist independently in 1923. During the early 20s, all engines were renumbered after the railway grouped with the LMS in 1923 and continued operating with these numbers up until their withdrawal dates. As I'm looking through the histories and work life of these locomotives, I realize how very neat and wonderful they were in design, strength, and efficiency, but that's just it though. For I also realized some sad things about them too. One of them being that so little of these engines were built with their classes, with most being up to around 8 or so members. Look, I know you have a lot of locos out there that had little members of their class design, but it's just, to me, as a train fan, it makes no sense how some of these pretty looking locos could have only 1 or 2 of their class built and not have more recognition. For example, looking at the 062 Cleator tanks, I really admire the wheel arrangement as they were borrowed from Class 7 tender locos, and how powerful they were with freight and later commuter line passenger trains. But at the same time, it's unfortunate that so little were around at the time, with only 3 L1 Cleators built and only 6 L3 Cleators built. I mean, if you look at the pics yourself, you can get the idea of how pretty long these things must have been. Also, the J1s, aka Albert's class. I've said in a tweet some time ago that the J1s looked quite impressive for tank engines reshaped from tender engines, and I still stand by this point. The 4 big driving wheels of the E1 look cool under the J1, and the overall redesign looks so good that you wouldn't even think that it used to be a tender engine. I only wish they could have built more than 7 of them because they were some top-notch looking little engines. It's such a shame they were gone too soon. R.I.P. indeed, Albert. What a sad end. Bottom line, it's such a real shame that some of these magnificent steamies on this railway has such small quantities made, because it would have been a real treat if more were in steam, in my opinion. Another unfortunate thing about the Furness locos is how some also weren't in service that long either. Looking at the build years and withdrawal years for them, I noticed that a majority only ran in a span of around between 15 to over 20 years or so, with a lot being scrapped before nationalization or even World War II. Now, I know you do have some engines that be withdrawn early like that because they were either not built quite right or weren't the best in performance, etc. But some of these Furness engines had some pretty great performances and working abilities. For instances, the K2s, aka Edwards class, were excellent at their express duties with a high speed of 80 to 85 miles per hour, which is pretty damn impressive for a locomotive at its time. But the class itself only lasted for around short of 30 years or so and were scrapped around the late 1920s, which was most likely due to the fact that around that time, newer and larger express engines were being produced to take over the work, especially after the Furness joined the LMS where there were more engines, despite the replacements already happening earlier in the 20s with the 115 tank engine class. And thus, the poor K2s were seen as obsolete, much like poor old Edward himself. However, thankfully, Edward thrived in life much longer than his K2 counterparts, and throughout his time, proved himself to be stronger and braver than how the bigger engines viewed him as, especially Gordon. I find it strangely ironic how the K2s themselves were only in service for a short period of time and didn't survive to see the light of day for long, but yet Edward the Blue Engine, a fictional steam engine character based on this design, is one of the most iconic locomotive characters out there and, in his universe anyway, lived and lasted way longer after his siblings were scrapped. Not to mention was the very first character ever created for the entire Thomas and Friends franchise itself. So many amazing pointers about Edward, which is sadly more than I can say for the members of his class. Speaking of the 115 tank engines, also Furness Railway engines, even though they took over from the K2s, they were only around for like between 14 to 20 years, being built between 1920 and 1921, and being scrapped in between 1935 and 1940. So much for that replacement. Then there's the Pettigrew M1442T class, whose roles were managing branch services on the railway's Lakeside and Coniston lines, but get this, they were only in service for just 15 years. Like, are you joking? These poor big little guys didn't stand a chance. I really like the look on them too, because the 4-reel arrangement at the front, complemented by the slender part of their boiler, the funnel, and their big size, almost reminds me of the Adams Radio 442T class. At least one of them is still running today on the Bluebell. Absolutely heartbreaking how they didn't even last past 2 decades. R.I.P. M1s. The more I glanced at the pictures and talents of these fine but short-lived steamies, the more I realized that their things like designs, specifications, and their contributions to the Furness could have easily made them fit for preservation. Out of all the brilliant engines this old railway had, the only two that are properly preserved and look in great condition today are engines number 3 and 20, with the latter still running under her own power pulling specials at the Ribble Steam Railway in Preston, Lancashire, making her the oldest working steam engine in all of Britain. Now that is a huge W for the Furness. To have one of their locos be the oldest one in steam, pretty damn impressive. It's also great to see James Ramsden's second engine number 3 still around. Furness number 25 is also still here today. Sort of. The last update from it is that parts of its saddle tank rebuild form are at the Ribble Steam Railway, where it still waits for restoration. I couldn't find an update for it as of 2025, so if anyone does, let me know in the comments. Lost engine D1 class 060 number 115 could be said as preserved, although I really wouldn't count it as so, seeing how it fell down a mine hole in the 1890s. You know, the event that totally has nothing to do with down the mine from TNF. And it's probably still in there today. And I know steel and metal can eventually go through erosion over time, so it may be rotted into the earth by now. Horrible fate, by the way. However, despite all of this, it still makes me sad that the rest of these engines were mostly gone before nationalization rolled around, because they were tragically gone way too soon in my opinion. If an old relic like Fire Queen from Aberystwyth could be preserved, then why couldn't a good old Furness Railway Class K4 be the same way? In conclusion, to me, it's kind of devastating that these Furness Railway engines didn't really have longer days of railway life. From express services to branch line passenger trains to shunting work and managing freight work that kept their line not only running but receiving positive feedback when times got rough, it is without a doubt that this fleet of cool giant steam kettles made one hell of a legacy for their railway, and it's a shame that they were either unproduced or disposed of too quickly after service. And it's also a shame that they, along with the Furness Railway itself really, pre-LMS anyway, are often dismissed and not discussed a lot, and I definitely want to talk about those engines in this video, for I think that I, as well as many others, will agree that it would be wonderful if we saw some of these glorious things in museums in present day. They for sure deserve time in the spotlight. So, on that note, even though they're all long gone, let's try to keep the working memories of these Furness Railway legends alive. Link to the Furness Railway Trust is in the description below. Be sure to check out their website discussing their locomotives like number 20, rolling stock, events, books, and more. Now based in Preston, Lancashire. Show them some support. Again, link in the description. Some of my favorite Furness Railway engines are the J1 rebuilds, the K2s, the D1s, the M1s, and the G5s. Which, by the way, who else here thinks that a G5 would make a great alternate basis for Thomas? They just look so similar and so cool. If you have a favorite Furness Railway engine, what's yours? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see y'all in the next video. Take care.